On the morning of July 15th, 1997, Miami looked exactly like the kind of place Gianni Versace had helped teach the world to desire. Sunlight on white stone, heat rising off the pavement, luxury pretending to be effortless. Outside Casa Casuarina, his mansion on Ocean Drive, everything carried the polished illusion of wealth under control. Versace had stepped out for the simplest of routines and returned to the gates of the home he had transformed into a monument of beauty, taste, and power. Then the illusion shattered. Gunshots cut through the morning, and one of the most recognizable men in global fashion collapsed on his own steps. In a single moment, the world of silk, gold, glamour, and celebrity was pierced by something brutal, public, and impossible to style away. The news spread with the force of disbelief. Gianni Versace was dead, shot in broad daylight, outside the house that had become part of his myth. Television networks interrupted coverage, newspapers rushed out special editions. Fashion editors, supermodels, actors, musicians, and designers reacted not like colleagues losing a professional giant, but like witnesses to an unthinkable rupture. Because Versace was not just another designer name stitched into labels, he was the architect of a visual empire. He had turned fashion into spectacle, sex, theater, and status all at once. He dressed royalty, rock stars, supermodels, and the new elite of the 1990s. His runways did not merely present clothes, they produced fantasy. So when he was killed, it felt like more than a murder. It felt like an attack on an entire era of excess, image, and cultural confidence. And that is why this story does not begin in an atelier or on a runway. It begins at the gate, in blood and marble, because the end reveals the scale of what had been built. How does the son of a seamstress from southern Italy become the man who defines global luxury, only to die in one of the ugliest moments imaginable? How does someone who spent his life creating beauty become trapped in a death scene the whole world can picture? To understand why the murder of Gianni Versace still feels cold decades later, we have to go back before the mansion, before the supermodels, before the Medusa logo, before Miami.
We have to return to Reggio Calabria, to a boy surrounded by fabric, needles, and the first quiet lessons in how beauty can command power, and how power always attracts shadows.
Before Gianni Versace became a global symbol of luxury, he was a boy growing up in Reggio Calabria, in the far south of Italy, where beauty was not yet industry, it was atmosphere. He was born in 1946 into a family that lived close to craft, discipline, and appearance. His mother, Francesca, was a dressmaker, and her atelier became one of the first worlds he truly understood. For Gianni, fabric was never just fabric. It had movement, weight, drama, and possibility. While other children were simply surrounded by adulthood, he was surrounded by transformation. Women entering as themselves and leaving as something heightened, sharpened, more powerful. That matters because Gianni did not discover fashion as a marketplace first. He discovered it as theater, as identity, as the emotional force of surface. Long before he had a brand, he had an eye. The landscape around him also left its mark. Southern Italy gave him more than family roots. It gave him visual memory. Classical ruins, Mediterranean light, Catholic imagery, sensuality, ornament, and the intensity of old-world femininity all entered his imagination early. The later Versace world, gold, myth, skin, excess, ancient symbols reborn as modern seduction, did not appear from nowhere. Its DNA was already there in Calabria. He learned by watching his mother fit garments on real bodies, by seeing how confidence could be constructed stitch by stitch, by understanding that clothing was never neutral. It could announce status, desire, rebellion, or command. Even as a boy, he seemed drawn not only to making things beautiful, but to making beauty impossible to ignore. But childhood in Reggio Calabria was not some golden runway prologue. It was provincial, limited, and far from the centers of power that would later define him. That distance is part of what made his ambition so fierce. He was not born in Milan or Paris. He was not raised inside established fashion prestige. He had to imagine his way out. As he grew older, helping more directly in the atelier, absorbing technique and style, it became increasingly clear that his relationship to design was not casual. He understood line, body, mood, and effect in a way that went beyond apprenticeship. The son of a seamstress was already beginning to see that clothing could be architecture for fantasy, and fantasy, in Gianni's life, would become serious business. Before fame, before palaces and pop stars, before the Medusa head became one of fashion's most recognizable emblems, there was a young man in southern Italy learning one of the oldest lessons in beauty. If you can control how the world sees you, you can control far more than appearance. That insight would carry him far beyond Reggio Calabria. but its first stitches were sewn at home. When Gianni Versace left southern Italy and moved into the orbit of Milan, he did not arrive as an outsider begging to be accepted. He arrived with a visual instinct already fully awake. Milan in the 1970s was becoming the center of a new Italian fashion power, but it still had rules, codes of elegance, restraint, hierarchy, and taste. Versace understood those rules almost immediately and then began breaking them on purpose. His early work for established labels showed that he could cut, shape, and construct with technical intelligence. But technique alone was never going to be his final language. He wanted more than respect. He wanted impact. When he launched the Gianni Versace label in 1978, the difference was obvious. His clothes did not whisper refinement. They declared it. They clung, flashed, opened, sculpted, and seduced. He fused classical references with modern sexuality, luxury with danger, tailoring with provocation. In a fashion world that often separated elegance from desire, Versace made desire itself elegant. He understood something fundamental. People do not always remember the most tasteful image, but they never forget the one that makes them feel power. That instinct is what turned Versace from a successful designer into a force. By the 1980s, his runway shows were no longer simply presentations of seasonal collections. They were events, charged, theatrical, almost cinematic in the way they announced themselves. The cuts were bolder, the colors louder, the prints unmistakable. Baroque motifs, metal mesh, black leather, bright color, the Medusa head, mythology, skin, and spectacle all merged into a world that felt instantly identifiable. Versace was not designing for anonymity. He was designing for visibility. He understood the new age of fame better than many people inside the fashion industry did. Film stars, pop stars, society women, and rising celebrities did not want to disappear into clothing. They wanted clothing that amplified their myth. Versace gave them exactly that. He dressed women to look expensive, dangerous, unforgettable, and he did the same for men, refusing the old idea that male fashion had to remain safe in order to be powerful. Under Gianni Versace, fashion did not behave. It performed. Then came the 1990s, and with them, the moment Versace stopped being only a designer and became one of the architects of pop culture itself. The supermodel era, Naomi Campbell, Cindy Crawford, Linda Evangelista, Christy Turlington, Claudia Schiffer, did not happen through fashion alone, but Versace helped make it explode. He understood that beauty, celebrity, music, and image were no longer separate worlds. They were becoming one system. His runways turned models into icons and clothes into headlines. He dressed Madonna, Princess Diana, Elton John, George Michael, and a universe of famous bodies that helped carry the Versace silhouette across the planet. He worked at the exact point where fashion met television, tabloid culture, music videos, and the growing global appetite for glamour. That is why his impact felt bigger than cloth. He was designing what power looked like at the end of the 20th century. And because he was doing it with such confidence, the brand stopped feeling like a label and started feeling like a kingdom. But that kingdom was never only about wealth. It was about identity as performance. Versace gave people costumes for the version of themselves they most wanted the world to see. Stronger, sexier, richer, more untouchable. In that sense, he was doing something very modern. He was selling transformation. That is why Gianni Versace mattered beyond the runway. He didn't just clothe the famous. He helped invent the visual language of fame itself. By the time the 1990s reached their peak, he had done something rare even in fashion. He had become instantly recognizable to people who knew nothing about design theory, tailoring, or Italian craft. They knew the look. They knew the attitude. They knew the name. Gianni Versace had not simply made fashion louder. He had made it impossible to ignore. And once a man builds a world that dazzling, the danger begins to grow with it. Because the brighter the image becomes, the harder it is to see what waits in the shadows beyond the flash. By the 1990s, Gianni Versace was no longer simply designing clothes. He was carrying an empire on his back. His name stood for luxury, sex, confidence, celebrity, and visual excess at the exact moment the world became obsessed with image. But building a universe that dazzling comes with a hidden cost. Every collection had to be bigger, every show had to be louder, every season had to prove that the Versace world was still the place where power looked most seductive. That kind of pressure does not leave much room for rest. Publicly, Gianni seemed in command. Smiling, polished, surrounded by supermodels, stars, and the shimmering confidence of success. Privately, the demands were relentless. The larger the brand became, the less ordinary life remained possible. He was not only making fashion, he was feeding an appetite that never stopped asking for more. At the same time, fame turned him into something vulnerable in a way beauty often does. Versace was intensely visible. His homes, his friendships, his tastes, his routines, his body, even his private relationships became part of the media mythology around him. He lived inside a world of admiration, but admiration at that level always comes mixed with intrusion. The public saw glamour. What it did not always see was exposure. Gianni was a gay Italian man who had built one of the boldest fashion empires in the world, and his success itself made him a subject of fascination, projection, envy, and scrutiny. He was not a hidden genius sketching in silence. He was the face of the house, the symbol of the fantasy, the man people wanted to photograph, decode, imitate, and discuss. The more iconic he became, the less invisible he could ever be again. And beneath all of this, there were signs of fragility. In his final years, those close to him understood that Gianni was no longer made only of force and glamour. There were health struggles, periods of physical weakness, and a growing sense that the man who had dressed the world in confidence was himself becoming more delicate than the image around him allowed. That contrast is what makes this chapter so haunting. Versace created a visual language of strength, sensuality, and invincibility, but the human being behind it was still subject to fatigue, fear, pain, and time. The empire looked untouchable. The man was not. And that is what makes the next chapter feel so cold. The world had been staring at the gold, the marble, the silk, and the spectacle for years, without realizing how exposed the man at the center of it had become. On July 15, 1997, the murder of Gianni Versace became more than a crime story. It became a global spectacle of shock, fear, and frozen glamour. The image was too stark to process easily. One of the most powerful names in fashion, shot on the steps of his own mansion in broad daylight, in one of the most photographed cities in America. The man accused was Andrew Cunanan, already wanted in connection with multiple killings, and suddenly the case expanded from tragedy into obsession. News channels ran the story without pause. Newspapers printed the mansion gates, the marble steps, the police tape, the stunned faces of friends and staff. Fashion had always known how to turn an image into myth. Now it was trapped inside an image it could not control. The house that had symbolized luxury, beauty, and theatrical self-invention became overnight a crime scene the whole world could recognize. What followed was confusion, grief, and a strange kind of public violation. The investigation moved fast, but not fast enough to satisfy the frenzy around the case. Questions multiplied. How had a man so famous, so visibly wealthy, and so clearly vulnerable been left exposed like this? Why had the threat not been stopped sooner? And what did it mean that one of the great designers of the 20th century had died not in private decline, but in sudden violence that played perfectly into the ruthless appetite of modern media? For those closest to him, the horror was personal and immediate. For the wider public, it became one of those rare deaths that instantly harden into cultural memory. Gianni Versace was no longer only a designer. He was now part of a true crime headline, a symbol of how beauty and danger can exist only inches apart. Then came the funeral in Milan, and the story changed again. What violence had made brutal, ritual tried to make solemn. Inside the cathedral, grief gathered in the form of high fashion, celebrity, family, silence, and disbelief. Princess Diana, Elton John, Naomi Campbell, Sting, and a line of major public figures arrived not for a red carpet, but for mourning. The images from that day remain some of the most haunting in modern celebrity history because they look like two worlds colliding: sacred ceremony and pop cultural royalty, private devastation and public iconography. It was only weeks before Princess Diana herself would die, which gives those funeral images an even colder afterglow now. In that cathedral, the world was not merely burying a man. It was burying a style of confidence, a visual era, and the person who had made glamour look fearless. But houses do not die when their creators do. That is the final twist in Gianni Versace's story. After his murder, Donatella Versace carried the name forward, transforming grief into continuation. The brand survived, evolved, and remained globally powerful, not because Gianni could be replaced, but because his visual language had already entered culture too deeply to disappear. That is why the end still feels so sharp. They killed the man, but the image kept living. The gates remained. The Medusa remained. The idea of Versace, beauty as seduction, style as power, excess as art, remained. Gianni Versace died on marble steps in Miami, but the world he built never stopped looking back.